Boa noite a todos. Meus agradecimentos à nossa distinta audiência e, em especial, ao nosso ilustre palestrante, Sir Jonathan Porritt. Iniciaremos o evento com um curto vídeo comemorativo dos 40 anos da FIA.
A FIA dedica-se à geração de conhecimento aplicado e de novos conceitos para experiência na administração empresarial e pública. É uma referência de ensino, desde o curso de graduação em Administração e Negócios até os cursos de pós-graduação, MBA, pós-MBA, mestrado profissional, cursos de educação executiva e em EAD, bem como nos projetos de consultoria e pesquisa aplicada. A FIA olha para o futuro com determinação, mirando a construção de uma sociedade mais evoluída, consciente e justa, entendendo que o mundo está em evolução e em grande mudança, gerando oportunidades e desafios que construirão uma sociedade coerente com os novos tempos. A FIA é muito mais que uma escola de negócios. É educação, pesquisa e consultoria, com projetos de relevância e impacto social positivo, colaborando com pessoas e organizações em todos os níveis. FIA 40 anos. Isso faz diferença.
A FIA é uma instituição sem fins lucrativos, criada em 1980 por professores da FEA-USP que buscavam uma nova forma de compartilhar a produção e disseminação de conhecimentos a uma parcela muito maior da sociedade do que aquela que já vinha sido atendida pela USP. Esta iniciativa se mostrou muito exitosa. Hoje, a FIA é uma referência acadêmica presente em rankings nacionais e internacionais. Este ano, a FIA comemora 40 anos com o orgulho e a satisfação de ostentar alto nível de excelência em cursos de graduação, pós-graduação, MBAs, pesquisa e consultoria. Para comemorar o seu aniversário, a FIA organizou esta Masterclass com o objetivo de compartilhar com a sociedade um tema da maior transcendência, que no momento é não só fundamental, como urgente, pois trata-se de uma ameaça muito maior do que a Covid-19, conhecido como emergência climática. Hoje, no Brasil e no mundo, a questão da responsabilidade ambiental e da justiça social é um desafio que alcança toda a humanidade, como empresas, governo, academia, ONGs, instituições das mais variadas naturezas. E, particularmente, cada um de nós permitirá confrontar a ameaça que nos ronda de forma cada vez mais ameaçadora. Finalizo agradecendo mais uma vez a honrosa atenção de vocês para este nosso importante evento. Passo agora a palavra à doutora Mônica Kruglianskas, nossa parceira no Reino Unido, para proceder à apresentação formal do evento e do nosso ilustre palestrante. Tenhamos todos um ótimo evento. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada, professor. Boa noite a todos. Meu nome é Mônica Kruglianskas. Eu estou aqui em Londres, como o professor falou, bem próximo do nosso palestrante. Vou passar algumas informações práticas sobre o evento e apresentar o Jonathan a vocês. Este evento consistirá de uma aula magna a ser administrada por um dos maiores especialistas contemporâneos nessa área, Sir Jonathan Porritt, que acaba de lançar seu novo livro, Hope in Hell, A Decade to Confront the Climate Emergency, cuja temática constitui embasamento para o curso Negócios Sustentáveis na Prática, de 30 horas que a FIA está lançando para o início de outubro deste ano, também no formato EAD ao vivo. O livro é esse aqui, e parafraseando a Cristina Figueres, este livro é uma eloquente, ponderada e convincente afirmação de que podemos enfrentar a crise climática se nos empenharmos nisso. A aula tem tradução simultânea e você pode escolher que idioma quer escutar, selecionando no globo, na parte de baixo da tela, a opção português ou inglês. A proposta dessa aula é ser o mais interativa possível e durante a apresentação eu receberei as perguntas que vocês postarem no chat e vou procurar agregá-las de modo que o maior número possível delas sejam respondidas. Nós estamos planejando os 40 minutos finais para isso. Nós também vamos sortear até o final dessa Masterclass 6 exemplares do livro Hope in Hell. São 2 e-books e 4 livros impressos. Para quem quiser participar do sorteio, por favor, preencher o formulário que será enviado pelo link através do chat até às 19 horas, colocando o mesmo e-mail que você utilizou na inscrição desse curso. Aos participantes que quiserem o certificado FIA, será enviado um e-mail de confirmação ao final do evento. Ok. Agora que eu já falei das questões práticas, eu vou apresentar o Jonathan, mas agora eu vou falar em inglês. Então, se vocês quiserem a tradução, é o momento de clicar ali no globo lá embaixo. So, it's a great honor for me to introduce our very special guest today. This is, as Professor Isaac mentioned before, a very special occasion for the FIA community, but also because it's the first time Jonathan is speaking to our Brazilian community. For many of you, this introduction may not be necessary, but I will stick to tradition and read to you all the information I have here in front of me. So, Sir Jonathan Porritt is an eminent writer, broadcaster, and campaigner on sustainable development. He is the founder and director of Forum for the Future, the leading sustainable development charity in the UK, which is also present in New York, Singapore, and Mumbai, directly working with companies like Unilever, Marks and Spencer's, Air New Zealand, and Sam Darby Palm Oil in Asia, amongst others. He says the idea to found Forum in 1996 came after he attended the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. In his words, I had spent the preceding 20 years campaigning against things and desperately needed to get some more positive energy flowing. So I like to believe that he got some positive energy flowing as a result of his trip to Rio.
Oh, yes.
Jonathan acts as an advisor to many bodies in sustainability matters, as well as to individuals, including, for example, Prince Charles and the CEO of Unilever, or the Green Party, which he has always been a member. He's also involved in many different initiatives. He is the president of Population Matters, president of Conservation Volunteers. He's director of Collective, an online platform celebrating sustainable innovation. He's also the chancellor of Kiel University. In the past, he was director of Friends of the Earth until 1990, a trustee to WWF, and from 2000 to 2009, he chaired the Sustainable Development Commission set up by Prime Minister Tony Blair. What a list. So I've met Jonathan soon after I moved to the UK about 6-7 years ago. And since then, I had the privilege to work with Jonathan in different projects. He consistently brings so much enthusiasm and energy to everything he's involved with, but more importantly, a positive and constructive approach that makes huge challenges seem so doable. Brazil has always been in my conversations with Jonathan, who I feel deeply cares about the issues we Brazilians face. He's now a good friend as well, and I'm delighted that he accepted our invitation to be here tonight, given that it's 10 p.m. here in England. So I want to thank again everybody who is attending here tonight, and wish you a pleasant evening. And Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Monica, thank you very much for those warm words of introduction. And Professor Isaac, delightful to share an event with you. It's quite a long time since we met each other in Sao Paulo, but obviously I know about the work of FIA, and Monica keeps me well informed about all the new initiatives that are going on, and especially, of course, in your 40th anniversary. So for me, this is a real privilege to be able to play some small part in your 40th anniversary, because this is a very special institution. And I am well aware of the critical role of FIA in Brazil in terms of the contribution that you make to, not just as you put it in the film, not just to education in business and public administration, but also in terms of enabling people to see the world differently. And for me, most importantly of all, to see the connections between things. And I guess if there was one sort of pointer for me in terms of people who are thinking of making the rest of their life in business or in public administration. The really critical thing is to keep the widest possible perspective, the broadest horizon that you possibly can, so you don't disappear into a very narrow mindset in order to get your immediate job done. That's, in essence, why sustainability is so important in today's world. So I'm just delighted to have an opportunity to share that with you. And the way we're going to do this, I'm going to talk now for about 20-25 minutes. I'm going to explain a little bit about the key elements in the book, what I was hoping to achieve through the book, and to share that with you, and to share why it was a difficult book for me to write personally as well as professionally, because it exposes, I hope, exposes the reader to a lot of quite intense questioning about where you think we are in the world today and why we are in such a difficult place. And I felt that personally. It wasn't just that I was writing it from a distance. It was right deep down in myself, trying to get a grip on a better understanding of why we've got ourselves into this mess and what we now need to do to get ourselves out of this mess. And I promise you, I will get the balance right between why we're in the mess we're in now, which is not comfortable and quite depressing, to be honest, and the balance between why that doesn't have to be the case for very much longer, why we have all the resources we need, in fact, to change things around, transform the nature of our economies and the nature of global politics. I guess it's that balancing act that is really important. And it was at Rio de Janeiro at the Earth Summit, as Dr. Monica mentioned, that I came to understand that in order to achieve real transformation in any particular walk of life, it's crucial that one is able to call on people's positive energy as well as on what it is that makes them feel angry about the state of the world. And for the last 30 years, I've really tried to emphasize this notion of positive energy and how we can work more effectively with that. And that's essentially what I do in all the different roles that I have here in the UK and internationally, is to try and summon up that sense of there being solutions to pretty much everything that we have to deal with today. It would be difficult if we didn't still have those solutions, because then we'd all be looking out on each other with very glum faces indeed. But the most important influence for me in writing Hope in Hell was the conversations that I was having with students at my university here in the UK, the University of Kiel, in the Midlands, just between Manchester and Birmingham, and a wonderful university where I've been talking a lot with young people. And what I experienced last year, this is in 2019, much more than I had ever experienced before, was this sense of anger, this sense of, how dare you, how can your generation have left us with such an extraordinarily difficult, painful inheritance? What's been going on for the last 30, 40 years? And this anger was something very new to me. And it was, of course, in 2019 that we saw the emergence of much more direct action in the world of climate change, particularly with an organization called Extinction Rebellion here in the UK, taking direct action to force politicians to do more than they might otherwise want to do. And those conversations made me think, we can't just dump this responsibility on the shoulders of young people. My generation, we still have a job to do here. And I wanted to explain to young people and older people alike why it is that we're still entitled to have some authentic hope about the opportunity of getting this right. Now, hope is a very easy thing to talk about. It's not such an easy thing to feel deeply and authentically. And I get challenged all the time about whether one's hope is still legitimate. Is it still authentic? And I was reflecting on this, thinking about what I would share with you, the participants, for this event this evening. I was thinking about this on Sunday night when here in the UK, we had the latest film from the great Sir David Attenborough, perhaps not as famous in Brazil as he is here in the UK, but he is probably the global statesperson when it comes to talking about the natural world and our relationship to the natural world. And on Sunday, he produced his latest film called Extinction. And Extinction was all about how it is that we have allowed 1 million of the world's 8 million species to be at risk of extinction. It was completely depressing. And there's no point me trying to say it was anything other than depressing, because it didn't beat around the bush. It explained exactly what has been going on and what is still going on in all countries, rich world, poor world, north, south. This is not a story just about developing and emerging economies creating this new pattern of damage to the natural world. And the bit at the end, because as you know, most of these films usually end with somebody trying to say, but don't panic, it's all right, we can still get this right, we can still sort this out, was so weak, was so inadequate given the scale of the challenge that he had just laid in front of us, as to make me question, really, whether we have got the resources available to do what needs to be done. So I'm not going to try and present you with lots of facile reasons for young people to be optimistic or hopeful about the future, because there are no easy reasons. The starting point for any conversation I have with young people today is to acknowledge that the whole of the rest of your lives, however young you may be today, the whole of the rest of your lives will be lived under the shadow of climate change and of ecosystem damage. That is your reality. It's our reality as well, of course, but we've got slightly less long to live, obviously, than young people coming to that awareness today. That's the nature of the beast, and I'm very aware of the implications of that for young people today. I spend a lot of my time now working with young people here in the UK, with a lot of young climate activists involved in our school strikes movement, in a host of different initiatives, trying to find ways of enabling young people to be effective campaigners, to do more than my generation has been able to do. I think it's fair to try and just explain quickly the difference between climate change and every other pressure on the natural world, because you will know that the natural world, the environment, is under massive pressure in terms of impact on ecosystems, on species, through pollution, through the buildup of plastic in the world today, particularly in the world's oceans, through overfishing. This is a long, long list. But the amazing thing is that nature has an incredible capacity to heal itself. So one of the most remarkable bits of research that has been done is that as soon as you set aside large areas of the ocean or coastal environments, and you stop fishing, and you stop development, and you stop exploitation in those over-exploited areas, within a remarkably short period of time, those natural systems will reassert themselves. Fish species will start building up again. And this is a remarkable thing. And you can see it everywhere, that as long as we work with nature, not against nature, the healing capabilities of nature are extraordinary, quite extraordinary. So even with these terrible pressures on biodiversity and on the natural world, if we start getting smart about protecting those ecosystems, those special species, places, etc., then there isn't any reason why we wouldn't see those healing processes kick in. Climate change isn't really like that. Climate change is a very different story that we're facing. And because we have cumulatively, since the start of the Industrial Revolution 250 years ago, because we've put so huge a volume of these greenhouse gases, the carbon dioxide, the methane, the nitrous oxides, and so on, because we've pumped literally hundreds of billions of tons of these gases into the atmosphere, we can't suddenly undo all of that. The best we can do is to stop putting those gases into the atmosphere, because that will then slow the process. But what scientists are telling us now, what climate scientists are telling us now, is that we're in an extraordinarily difficult time, which is why I subtitled the book, A Decade to Confront the Climate Emergency. Because what we're seeing now is that the warming effect that has been with us now for the last 20, 30 years is, of course, beginning to impact every single aspect of the natural world. And I mean literally every single aspect. And this is the story of what are called feedback loops, where one change in a natural system causes other changes in other systems or in the same system. And these feedback loops can become extraordinarily dramatic. So to give you one classic example of this, which is of huge importance around the world, as average temperatures increase, we begin to see, as a feedback loop of average temperatures, the worsening of wildfires all around the world. And this is a phenomenon that is being felt, of course, in whether it's Australia or California, the Arctic, or indeed in Brazil itself. So these are classic feedback loops. And then the scientists remind us that these feedback loops take us close to what are called tipping points. And if you push a system or part of a system too far, then it will tip over into a new system or into a variation of that system. And the reason why we're talking about this next decade is because during the course of this decade, we might cause these irreversible tipping points, which we would then find it extremely hard to pull back from, to tip back, if you like, into the relatively stable conditions that humankind has enjoyed throughout its tenure on planet Earth. And that's what they call runaway climate change. Not just climate change getting worse and worse, but climate change running away from us and from our ability to put it right. So that's the really bad news. And the bad news about climate science is about as bad as it can get. Everything gets worse faster everywhere in the world. That's the shorthand version of what is happening to our climate today. Okay, that's the sort of reality, the physical reality of where we are today. What would anybody draw down on, therefore, to counterbalance that physical reality? Why is it even possible to suggest that there is still hope in a world that is changing so fast? And I think we have to start with the fact that the science of climate change now is extraordinarily strong. I'm sure, in fact, I know, in Brazil, as much as in America and India, and to a certain extent in the UK, there are still some people, really, in my opinion, remarkably stupid people, who continue to challenge the science of climate change. There is no legitimate scientific challenge to the basic consensus about climate change any longer. There just isn't. There may have been 20, 30 years ago, but there really isn't now. And the vast majority of human beings in the vast majority of countries now accept that science. So this is a huge step forward. We've got this incredibly authoritative scientific base, and that is helping increase people's awareness about the nature of this challenge and how we need to address it much more urgently than we've done in the past. So don't don't disregard the importance of that, because in order to move whole societies to change the way in which we live, the way in which we create wealth, the way in which we relate to the natural world, there has to be a rationale that people can grip hold of and accept as the dominant framework within which we now develop new ideas. So awareness and the science on which that awareness is based is really critical. And then, of course, we also see today, remarkably, incredible changes in the technologies available to us to address this. And some of these technologies are impactful right now, everywhere in the world, are already making a huge difference, particularly renewable energy sources, solar and wind in particular. Personally, I'm rather less keen on hydropower, which of course is a renewable source of electricity as well. But as you know very well, in Brazil, the pros and cons of hydropower are difficult to work through. So for me, the incredible transformation going on with solar energy and wind energy is utterly remarkable. And there are many mainstream economists and investors, analysts in the world's capital markets, who believe that as these sources of renewable electricity continue to get cheaper every year, and costs fall by somewhere between 7 and 8% still every year, as they go on getting cheaper, and as they go on getting more functional, effective, that there will very soon be a situation in which no other source of electricity can compete economically. So regardless of the environmental benefits, there won't be any economic competitors to these technologies at all. And this is true in the world's poorest countries, as well as in the world's wealthiest countries. This is a huge thing. And this is right now. This is absolutely right now. If we wanted to provide every single electron needed to provide electricity for the world by 2030, we could source all of that electricity from renewable sources by 2030. Not by 2040 or 2050, but by 2030. If our politicians understood the urgency of the challenge. This is not new. We've been watching this incredible technology story emerge for the last 20 years, but the impact is relatively new. And I find, astonishingly, in the work that I do, very, very few people understand the true nature of this, what I call renewables revolution. Not just a change in the energy system. This is a wholesale revolution, an extraordinary turning point in the affairs of humankind, because of course energy underpins all of our lives today. Without reliable, affordable, safe sources of energy, nobody can live a good life. So these technologies are right there, right now, for every single human being on this planet, rich or poor. And then we've got the next generation of technologies coming through. And right now there is a huge surge of interest, for instance, in hydrogen. And the reason for that is that we may be able to make hydrogen now using surplus renewable electricity. In the past, you couldn't use renewable electricity to make hydrogen. You had to use methane gas, basically, which meant there was no benefit from the climate point of view at all. But now, all around the world, investors are saying, if we can get our hydrogen from renewable electricity, we can start using this as a substitute energy source in steel mills. And there are now 3 steel mills already functioning in the world today using hydrogen instead of fossil fuels, instead of hydrocarbons. That we can use hydrogen in our cement kilns to make the cement on which so much the built environment depends. That we might be able to use hydrogen as a substitute for gas in other industrial processes. So if you look at what I call the technology pipeline, it is amazing. And it is a huge support to those who argue for us being able to have good, prosperous lives without irreparably damaging the planet. So we need to take heart from all of that, because by and large, that wasn't really the case up until quite recently. And then coming in behind that, you've also got the really critical thing about capital markets. Investors may be academically interested in climate change, but all they're really interested in, let's be absolutely candid, is how they can make money. How they can make money for themselves and how they can make money for their clients. And what we're seeing now, which I find absolutely riveting, is ever more influential leaders in the world's capital markets are saying, this is where we're going to get our revenues from in the future. And that means we will see a huge shift in capital moving out of those old energy sources and into these new sources of energy. And that's, again, hugely encouraging. So we've got these different forces going on. And in the book, I've tried to explain why, although the science is pretty hard to deal with and demonstrates the full dereliction of duty that we have shown over the last 30 years, the upside, the positive side, is pretty remarkable as well. And all we need now, and I say all, which is a very small word, but a very big thing, all we need now is for our politicians to narrow the gap between what the science tells us and what technology, a combination of technology, money, innovation, smart people, committed public servants, and wealth creators. They're the people who have to narrow that gap. And that's where I think we'll probably spend quite a bit of time this evening as we come on to explore the implications of all of that, because that's the story. That's why you are still entitled to genuinely authentic hope, is that that gap can still be narrowed. It really can. We really could do this to ensure a safe, compassionate, decent, sustainable world for 9 billion people by 2050. It is still available to us to do that. But obviously, it depends on a different quality of leadership than we're getting from our politicians today. So in Hope in Hell, I spend quite a bit of time looking at the politics of all of this. Where do we see real political leadership in the world today? Can we anticipate that that leadership, enlightened, progressive, far-sighted political leadership will grow? Or are we now confronting such a pattern of poor, dysfunctional leadership, political leadership in the world today, that even the most brilliant business leader or civil society activist or academic finds that the opportunities to make things change are severely constrained? And that's, I guess, the big challenge for all of us. It's very hard to watch President Trump visit California and look at the scale of damage being done in California and Oregon, on the whole of the West Coast now, and still come away saying that this has nothing to do with climate change. This is all about poor forestry management. Now, actually, there is a point to be made about forestry management, but to abuse the science of climate change on a visit like that is still pretty extraordinary. And as we know, Trump's influence on other politicians elsewhere in the world has been highly significant, including, of course, in your own country. So we're playing for big stakes now. We're looking at the prospect of us being able to create conditions for a good world, a better world, by 2050. We know pretty much now what needs to happen and the time period in which it needs to happen. And we are now all party to the process of making it happen. And it is that action-orientated side of things that I hope we can now come on to explore. So, Monica, I will stop my introductory comments there, and we can now pick up on various points that I know will be of interest to you and others. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So I have a lot of questions already popping in my screen here. I'm just going to say to our participants, please use the Q&A space in this chat, not the chat one, so that the questions are there, because there are a lot of messages in the chat, but we need to separate that from the questions. I have a few questions here. The first one, so the topic of this class, we named it Economic Recovery and Green Recovery. So one of the questions I have here is, what is then the role of business in that? What should they do? What should businesses do?
Yeah. Well, we set up my organization, Forum for the Future, back in 1996. And the explicit purpose of the forum is to work with business to persuade them to do more than they might otherwise be inclined to do, to move further and move faster. And to be honest, in the intervening 25 years since 1996, a lot of businesses have shifted their perspectives and done a huge amount to begin to understand the nature of what I call genuinely sustainable wealth creation. And that takes in environmental issues as well as social issues, concerns about governance within a company and how that company is actually managed, and a whole host of economic issues that companies also face. So I always credit companies when they take the actions that they know they need to take and speak up for the role of corporate sustainability as a very important contribution to some of the challenges that we're facing today. So for instance, in many countries today, business leaders have been very outspoken in terms of telling their governments that if you want to invest in getting our economies back up and running properly after COVID-19 or during COVID-19, because as we know, that's not going to come to an end anytime soon, then the best way of re-engaging in, reinvesting in our economies is through investments in green technology of every conceivable kind, whether that be in renewables or innovation, whether it's about restoring our damaged natural environment, whatever it might be. And this is true particularly for EU countries, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Sweden. The Danish business leaders have been very clear that it is simply not acceptable for politicians any longer to put the trillions of dollars that will be needed to rebuild prosperity in old fossil fuel, carbon intensive industries and companies. It's just not acceptable. And I celebrate this clarity of business leadership. They are spelling it out and saying, don't go back to the bad old ways. Use this to do what we need to do to create low carbon, ultra low carbon prosperity in the future. So this is a good thing, Monica. This is really encouraging. I just want to end this sort of endorsement about the role of business by reminding everybody listening to this that business has no mandate to change the nature of the economy, to change the rules by which wealth is created in our economies all around the world. It is only elected politicians in those countries that still have functioning democracies. It is only elected politicians that can frame the way in which the market operates. That is the job of governments. Those politicians are elected to shape the market and use market forces to achieve more sustainable outcomes rather than less sustainable outcomes. So anybody who tells me that a combination of business and enlightened civil society and academia and all the rest of it, they can sort it out almost without bothering about government any longer, I'm sorry to have to tell you that is an extraordinarily naive illusion. In the end, it is the politicians who will reshape the way in which market-based capitalism operates, with increasing pressure, in my opinion, coming from civil society, but that's another story, it's those politicians that will have to change the rules of the game if businesses are going to be able to do what they really need to do.
Okay. So talking about politicians, I have another question here about global politics. As you said, businesses are rule takers, not rule makers. So could you talk a little bit about the global scenario in terms of politics? Brazil has, we have our own reality, and you spoke a little bit about the US, but could you just give us a sense of, in terms of global politics, what's your view and what should we expect? What are we going to do about so many dysfunctional and underperforming governments around the world?
Yes, indeed. What are we going to do? The thing that people hang on to when they're trying to identify political leadership today is they tend to go back to the Paris Agreement, which was signed in Paris back in 2015. And the Paris Agreement consisted of almost every country in the world. As you know, the USA is now seeking to get out of the Paris Agreement, but almost every country committing to reduction in the emissions of these greenhouse gases in order to ensure a stable climate through to the end of this century. Now, what they committed to in Paris, frankly, was woefully inadequate. It would not guarantee a stable climate. And I won't get into the science of all of that now, but it was a start. And the reason why people refer back to Paris is that every single country during the Paris conference agreed that things had to change and we needed to do things differently. Now, in the intervening 5 years, unfortunately, not much has changed at all. We're still putting greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere to the tune of about 40 billion tons every year. We're still seeing significant levels of damage to the natural world, exacerbating these climate problems. And most politicians have not stepped up in the way that they said they would in Paris. So the challenge for all of us, both in what I call a functioning democracy, and I think the UK can still just about describe itself as a functioning democracy, although we do have some pretty strange things going on in our own country, as I'm sure you appreciate. But in functioning democracies, politicians need to be put under a lot more pressure in order to do what has to be done, in order to respond to a climate emergency. And that's the wording that is really important, not just the fact that climate is getting worse and worse every year, but a full-blown climate emergency. And when we confront an emergency, we come up with different responses, proportionate responses to that emergency. It is much harder, Monica, to talk about those countries where we have politicians who actually refuse even to acknowledge the basic science of climate change. President Trump preeminent amongst those, but there are a number of other significant climate deniers in the world's politics today. And they are causing a real drag on the rest of the world doing what needs to be done. So it's not easy in Brazil. And obviously you have a president who is not a full subscriber to the basic consensus about climate change and has committed to a whole range of policies during his time in power, particularly in terms of land use and the continuing problems about conversion of land for purposes to do with agriculture. He has committed to policies which will be very damaging for the world as a whole and for Brazil itself in the future. So there are no easy answers to this, but Brazil is still a functioning democracy. There isn't any reason why gathering concern about climate change won't play a bigger part in your politics, just as it will play, in my opinion, a bigger part in the politics of more and more countries as the citizens of those countries wake up to the reality of climate change. That's the truth of it. And in the EU, we are beginning to see that now. More and more governments are recognizing the full challenge of the climate emergency.
Okay. Gosh, I have so many questions here. it's getting a bit hard to gather them together so that you will have time to answer everything. So you spoke about land use. Could you talk a bit more? In your view, there's very slow progress in terms of policy changes needed to affect land use, like agriculture, forests, the food system, in comparison, for example, to the progress in technology-driven changes like you just described in energy, transport, and so on. What is your view on that?
I think this is a really critical moment we're at the moment. If you think about the dynamics about climate science, almost all the focus historically, all the way through to Paris, has been on industrial emissions, on the emissions caused by our economy from producing, manufacturing, extracting and manufacturing, and then disposing of the things, the products and the services that humankind depends on. And there was far less focus on the issues to do with land use and how important it is now to start thinking about land use, food and farming in particular, as the critical other part of the climate debate. Now, I'm encouraged by the fact that in the last 2 to 3 years, growing awareness of that, scientific awareness and political awareness, has begun to change the balance in the debate. And that's really crucial, because we're now very clear that if we can't bring forward equally radical ideas about changing land use, then we may be brilliant at achieving ever greater levels of decarbonization in energy, transport, infrastructure, urban planning, etc. But if we're still screwing up, English terminology, if we're still causing huge damage to the natural world, then we won't have got a win on our hands. We'll still have a very messy world to deal with. So for one example, for instance, just at the start of this week, in fact, yesterday, a new study was published based on some very detailed global analysis about the state of the world's soils. Because when you talk about food and farming, you're really talking about critical physical, biological dimensions of food and farming, the soil, the water, the biodiversity, the climate, etc., etc. And this new study has confirmed that a very significant percentage of the world's soils are now subject to negative pressures, that they are seeing erosion every year. It maybe wasn't quite as bad a story as we'd heard before, but it is a really chronic story. So shifting agricultural policy to ensure that soil is protected everywhere, in every country, for every crop, under any particular regime of subsidies, whatever it might be, will become more and more important. Not least because if we protect our soils, we keep more carbon in the soil. And indeed, we can actually store some of the carbon that we've put into the atmosphere back in our soils in order to slow down the rate of warming today. So that's one example. It would, of course, make a great deal of sense to stop cutting down the world's remaining forests. I don't want to bang on about that because people in Brazil have been thinking about that for a very, very long time. But it would make huge sense to find the right combination of economic and land use policies to slow and then pretty much eliminate continuing conversion of both tropical and temperate forests for further agricultural use. We don't actually need more land to feed the world, to meet the food needs of the world. What we need is massive improvements in the efficiency in the way we use that land and policies which will help address some of the systemic challenges that we face today. So, for instance, somewhere between 30 and 35% of all the food grown in the world today never meets its target, as it were, never helps create nutritious diets for human beings. It's wasted. It's wasted either on the farm itself, at the farm gate, in distribution, in storage, in manufacture, when it actually arrives in the supermarket, in food waste, then in our homes, between 30 and 35%. So if you want to make one big, massive difference to sustainable food and farming, seeking to reduce as far as possible that massive percentage, a third of all the food we grow. If we can reduce that, then we are well on the way to a much more sensible approach to managing our land as the precious asset that it really is.
Okay. John, I'm going to say I have more than 100 questions arriving. So
right, well.
Bear with me. And I'm trying to aggregate that. I have Roger's team, our team, trying to help me out because there's so much. They're really amazing questions. So I'm going to make a link now to COVID-19. There are lots of questions in that area. So COVID provoked some change in behavior of the government that were forced to adopt drastic measures. Do you think, do you believe that it has to become as drastic for governments to start to react? So do you think it will take more tragedies like fires and things like that for governments to start acting, changing?
I think that the impact of COVID-19 is very sharp and painful for societies all over the world now, and it will continue to be such for a long time to come. But the one thing that it has reminded us is that when governments are confronted by a full-on emergency of this kind, a pandemic of this kind, then the resources of government to address that crisis are astonishing. And if you look at how decades of neoliberal economic orthodoxy about what you can and can't do to change the nature of the economy just instantly swept aside. All of those political ideologues who have been arguing for the last 30 years that we need to reduce the size of the state, we need to make the market do the heavy lifting in our economy and forget governments. That's all gone. That's just literally yesterday's idiocy. And we now recognize that without government, one can't find the right balance between societal needs and the needs of the economy. So for me, we're going to continue to be reminded of the importance of government intervening in this kind of way. And they will need to intervene for many, many months to come, because short of that vaccine that everybody continues to talk about, it's going to be very difficult to get back to anything resembling normality. So the way in which governments reflate their economies, reinvest in job creation, for instance, is going to be absolutely fundamental. And different countries are taking very different stances on that. Just one very quick final point about COVID-19, if I may. I mentioned this film by David Attenborough on Sunday night. There's a very strong passage in that film in which a number of scientists spell out explicitly that pandemics of this kind, viruses of this kind, are a direct consequence of the continuing disruption of stable ecosystems, and in particular, continuing destruction of the world's forests. And it's not spelled out as a hypothesis. The case is made that this is clearly what lies behind COVID-19. And a number of scientists saying, if we don't stop this pattern of continuing destruction of the world's natural areas, then we should anticipate not just a pandemic every 100 years, but a virus-based pandemic of this kind on a much, much more frequent basis. And just imagine what would happen to our economies if we had another COVID-19 coming down the track at us in another 2 to 3 years. So this is a very strong case, of course, for protecting the world's remaining forests, particularly in South and Central America, in Africa, where a lot of the disruption has caused huge problems in the past. And let's not forget Ebola and HIV/AIDS, all of which can be tracked back to our disruption of those natural systems, and then through into Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, and so on. So this strengthens the case for ensuring that we protect our forests in a much more effective way than we've been able to do up until now.
Okay. Another question I have here, and it's appeared a few times, is so the science about climate change has been known since the 80s or even before. Why has it taken so long for us to start acting or reacting, especially in developing countries?
Yes.
What has stopped us from acting?
This is a very murky story, and it's actually shocking when you really look at why it is that it's taken us 40 years, because essentially the basic science about climate change was well understood, well argued by scientists from the late 1970s onwards, and was pretty much all understood by the end of the 1980s. And what I find so shocking about this is that it was exactly at that time that the boards of directors of the world's leading oil and gas companies, and those companies involved in mining and minerals, decided that this was such a threat to their commercial prospects that they needed deliberately to obscure that science, to cast doubt upon it, and to put off the day when those fossil fuel companies would be regulated to perform in a very different way. And hundreds of billions of dollars over the last 40 years have been spent directly through those oil and gas companies. And none of them is exempt from this criticism, by the way. All of them have done this. And through the think tanks that they deliberately funded, and through the politicians that they bribed, corrupted, bought to play their role, they very, very successfully cast this incredible pall of doubt over the science of climate change when there was really no doubt at all. And of course, the media then fell in with this. They decided they have to provide balance between those who were advocating for the science and those who didn't believe in the science. This is, of course, an insane idea that you either believe in science or you don't. I mean, that just shows us how far down the slippery slope we've gone in a country like the United States. And the media played a very significant role in slowing people's understanding, awareness of climate change. And that has cost us dear. We've literally lost 30 years in terms of this prevarication, this obscuring of the science, these delaying tactics. So I have to spell that out to you because that's the political reality. And I'm one of those now who wants to see the boards of directors and the chief executives of these companies all around the world found guilty of grotesque malpractice from a corporate governance point of view in terms of deceiving shareholders and essentially imperiling the future of humankind.
Thank you. Another question I have here, and there's so many of this. Let's see how I'm going to phrase that. So there's a direct relation between poverty and climate change, and those who are the most affected about it. Can you tell us a little bit more about this relationship? Because when we talk about climate change, we tend to look directly at environmental aspects. But the reality of it is that the most vulnerable are the most affected. Can you help us understand a little bit more this relationship?
Indeed. And I've written about this quite extensively in the book In Hope in Hell, because there have always been some people, Monica, who think that the environment is one sort of set of concerns, and then social justice is another completely different set of concerns, and they're not connected in one way or another way. And I've never subscribed to that. It seems to me that that's patently untrue. that environmental justice and social justice have to go hand in hand. And the proof of that, of course, is what your questioners have just raised here, is that it is very often those who are least able to cope with the impacts of climate change who are being the worst affected. So one of the fascinating things going on at the moment in the United States is the resurgence of the environmental justice movement. It's always been an important part of environmentalism in the USA, but for all sorts of different reasons, those very privileged, wealthy, predominantly white NGOs, non-governmental organizations based in Washington, working within the system, the political system, raising huge amounts of money from wealthy Americans, never understood the devastating impact of environmental abuse on millions of people in the South of the United States. And the pattern of abuse of that kind, where you can see any new developments in terms of a new refinery, a new railway line, a new manufacturing facility, a new chemical plant, a new intensive pig rearing unit, all of these massively impactful, health damaging investments were made in the poorest parts of the USA. And essentially it was Black communities that were predominantly affected by this, giving rise to the environmental justice movement. And what we're seeing now around the world is a recognition, thank heavens, that you can't deal with climate change unless you're prepared to be actively involved in campaigns for increased social justice. There is no solution to, quote, the climate problem unless we can work out a much fairer, equitable way of creating, managing, and distributing the world's wealth than we have been able to do up until now. And that will change capitalism. There's no question about that. There's no possible variation of today's kind of capitalism which will deliver us a stable climate for the future of humankind. It doesn't exist. We have to understand the scale of the changes we need to introduce in our capitalist economy. So for everybody, if I may, involved in FIA and the work that you're doing in FIA, this is an extraordinary challenge, because if we're going to find a way of addressing these existential threats to the future of humankind, then we have to come up with different ways, both in business management and in public administration terms. We have to come up with different ways of creating and distributing the wealth that we need. And that is absolutely fundamental to climate change. It isn't an environmental issue. Anybody who talks about climate change as an environmental issue just doesn't understand what it's all about. It is essentially an economic issue, an issue to do with democracy, an issue to do with justice. It's not primarily an environmental issue. And that is a big responsibility for people involved in higher education. I feel this very strongly in my role here at Keele University in the UK. We have to totally rethink the ways in which we engage with young people in any particular educational challenge.
Okay, right. So you've started talking about young people. I'm going to come back to that later because I have a question on that. But I have quite some questions about the energetic transition. And I'm going to try and combine this. So how does this transition to renewable energy should happen? Gradually or abruptly? So biodiesel, green diesel are gaining more relevance now. Are these kind of energy enough to retard the global warming effect, or should we focus on non-emission sources? But before you go that, let me just complement. Given the emergency we find ourselves now, that's another question. What do you think works best? Radical, accusatory campaigning, or a more positive activism, collaborative approach? I ask this because I know you have experience on both, and I was wondering if you could talk to us about what you think is the best route to move things in the speed that we actually need. Help us at FIA to help our students and our community here to do our job. Give us some light.
Well, a little bit of background, if I may, to explain this. So I joined the Green Party here in the UK in 1974 and spent the first 10 years of my life working through the Green Party, by far the most radical political party in the UK. And then I became director of Friends of the Earth, which again is a radical campaigning organization. So effectively, most of my first 20 years were involved in radical campaigns of one kind or another, including direct action campaigns. And it was only when I came to the conclusion that that was not enough that I decided to spend some time then working with business and working with government. So I was, as you heard in the introduction, I was 10 years the chair of the government's principal advisory body on sustainable development, working with Tony Blair and his ministers. And Forum for the Future works predominantly, as you've heard tonight, with big business. So I've spent the next 25 years of my life doing work more on the inside track, if you like, trying to harness that power and influence of people in positions of responsibility. I've come to the conclusion that that is not enough any longer. I don't believe that working the inside track, as I have done for the last 25 years, can bring about a process of change that is fast enough to respond to the climate emergency that we have today. So for me personally, and this is not something I advocate for everybody, but for me personally, the next phase of my life as a green activist will be to return much more to direct campaigning work, particularly in partnership with young climate activists here in the UK. And I have always been a very strong supporter of non-violent direct action, because I think that's an important part of the total political mix. This is a little bit difficult. I'm just thinking about anybody involved in the senior echelons of FIA. It's obviously a difficult thing to be Chancellor of University and to advocate that all one's students should be out there getting themselves arrested in order to put government under increased pressure. It's not easy to balance these different things. So there will need to be changes in my life. But the simple truth is, when I look at the political situation today, I know those politicians will not move far enough and fast enough without a great deal of additional pressure being brought to bear on them. I just know that. And I know it because I've spent such a long time working with them, trying to get them to do things more urgently. And once you come to that conclusion, you can't say, oh, well, you know, too bad, we'll just carry on in this incremental change process. We know it's not enough, but it's better than nothing. So we'll just make the most of it. I had to confront, in writing Hope in Hell, I had to confront the reality that that meant significant personal and professional changes for me in terms of what I do next. And that it's been difficult making sense of that during COVID-19. I haven't moved very far from my desk, frankly, for 6 months. I haven't been outside doing anything, let alone radical campaigning. So it's everything like that has been put on hold. But I know personally that I will have to make some changes, and that's a rather interesting stage for me to arrive at the grand old age of 70, as you can imagine. But there you are. So pendulum swing, that's the great thing about pendulums. As long as they keep swinging, all will be well.
Okay. All right. So I have another question here. I think I'm going to give you a couple of questions more, and then we will be closing soon, because we've covered a lot of things. Really, the questions keep coming, and it's just so much. But it's been a challenge to summarize everything. So, so how do you see the future of Brazil in this international scenario? how different do you see the impact of some of these issues in emerging countries and developed countries in general?
Yeah, Brazil is such an important country from the perspective of a sustainable world, for obvious reasons. And I'm not just talking about the Amazon and the Cerrado and all your other amazing ecosystems, the Pantanal and so on. I'm talking much more about Brazil's role in the global economy, and in particular, the role it now plays in global commodity-based agriculture. And there is going to be some clear leadership challenges for the way in which Brazil has carved out its influence in the world. If you look, for instance, at the massive growth in both cattle and soya production, which have obviously benefited Brazil's economy enormously over the last 20 or 30 years, my reckoning is that one of the preconditions for arriving at a sustainable world will be a wholesale reduction in consumption of animal-based protein. Not a popular thing to say in some parts of the world. Indeed, there are some parts of America where you'd pretty much be taken out and lynched for suggesting this, but it's not possible to keep on increasing per capita meat consumption in the world and imagine that we're going to have a sustainable future, because we're not. So we're going to see, I believe, and I think a lot of young people are now taking up this challenge personally in terms of their own dietary choices. I think we'll see massive reductions in our dependence on animal-based protein. Now for Brazil, this is absolutely critical, because the idea that Brazil can just go on producing more and more soya to feed more and more Chinese pigs, for instance, or chickens here in the UK, or whatever it might be, is a very dangerous illusion, and one that I think it would be good for smart, intelligent Brazilian commentators and politicians to begin to understand the limitations of. So Brazil is a country of massive wealth, as we know, extraordinary natural wealth. And the real challenge for all young Brazilians now is how can that natural wealth be managed effectively to continue to improve the condition of large numbers of your fellow citizens who do not enjoy a high material standard of living? How can the natural wealth be used to continue to promote a more equitable and just economy than is the case at the moment? So I look at Brazil as one of the absolutely key countries in the world today in terms of making the changes that are going to be necessary in the future. And this will all be about enlightened political leadership, which in my opinion will be influenced most strongly by young people as they come to understand the nature of the challenges your country faces.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you spoke about the young people, because they are the future, isn't it? And they need to be supported. So thank you.
Indeed.
Yeah. Jonathan, really, I have so much to ask you, but I think we are advancing a little bit with the hour. It's I wanted to ask you, do you want to make any comments yourself? Is there anything that we didn't cover that you would like to bring to our audience before we start closing?
Well, only perhaps just to add a little bit to this story about intergenerational justice. I love the concept of sustainable development. Okay, for me, when the Brundtland Report was issued in 1987, it just seemed to make good sense to me, because we know we need to meet the needs of the world's poor. We know we need to go on improving health conditions and education and diet for billions of people around the world. And don't forget, we're still living in a world where more than 50% of people on this planet live on less than $5 a day. I mean, this is not, when people talk about our rich planet, most people don't know what that means. And we know we've got to do something about that. So for me, the concept of sustainable economic development, i.e. improving the life chances of people through improvements in basic public services and material standard of living, was always what drove me. I'm not really a conventional greenie, as in, birds and animals first and then human beings second. For me, the driver for all of my years of involvement in this has always been working to bring about a better world for people. And I was lucky enough to recognize very early in my political life that if you wanted a better world for people, then you better sort out our relationship with the natural world. So the concept of sustainable development has at its heart the notion of intergenerational justice. One generation making sure that the world it passes on to the next generation is in at least as good a state as that in which they inherited it themselves. And that, of course, is captured in the definition of sustainable development. It means a great deal. Now, right now, in all honesty, the world that young people today will inherit from older generations will be significantly worse than the world that we ourselves inherited, massively impaired, at much greater risk of not being able to meet the needs of humankind, not creating the options and possibilities for young people today. So my driver now is this notion of bringing together young people and what I politely describe as older citizens, as it were. You don't necessarily have to be 70, but definitely it helps. But people who have come to the conclusion that this is outrageous, that we have failed so seriously in our duties, and working really closely together with young people. So most of my work outside of Forum for the Future at the moment is working with young climate activists and using some of whatever I've learnt in my many, many years of campaigning and sustainability activism to help young climate activists and enable them to be effective in the roles that they want to play. And I've become very aware that it is not fair for this generation to simply dump the responsibility for this on young people and say, well, we didn't manage to do very much, but hey, over to you, because now we know what it's all about and you're going to be able to sort it out on our behalf. That is not acceptable. Morally, pragmatically, from a values position, that is not acceptable. And I put a lot of store now, a lot of weight on the idea of generations working more effectively together to bring about the changes in a much faster period of time.
Yes, let's hope so.
Let's hope so, exactly.
Well, you clearly have a big audience here, and I imagine that everybody who is watching you now is feeling some hope to listen to you. So I think I'm going to close this conversation with you now. Conversations with Jonathan always make me feel like the critics are the real optimists. So I'm very grateful to hear you tonight again. And to close this exceptional class that Jonathan gave us, I'd like to quote a phrase from his book. It's a quote he uses by Joanna Macy that says, "Hope is something we do rather than have." So I truly hope that after listening to you, the people here will have hope by doing it, making it happen.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Thank you, Jonathan, for a lovely conversation. We have now some books to give away. So I'm going to call Fernando from our team, from Progesa, from FIA. Fernando will tell us how he's done this magic with the raffle of the books, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the courses that we're going to have upcoming. So, Fernando, over to you.
Boa noite, pessoal. Satisfação estar com vocês. Vamos voltar para o português aqui para facilitar o entendimento. Acho que o grande público nosso está aqui no Brasil. Então a gente tem um sorteio para fazer, né? A gente planilhou vocês, né? Vocês se inscreveram lá no formulário só para explicar as regras, né? A gente, claro, verificou os nomes dos inscritos pelo e-mail e também removemos os registros duplicados, né? Algumas pessoas às vezes não sabem se já preencheram, se já está valendo. Então, aqueles que a gente encontrou 2 vezes, a gente deixou uma vez só no sorteio. Se você, por acaso, botou 2 e-mails, nós vamos levar em conta o e-mail que você usou para se cadastrar no evento. Então, não se preocupe com isso. Então, vamos lá, deixa eu compartilhar a tela com vocês. Então, tá aparecendo aí, imagino eu, né?
Yes.
Nós colocamos os nomes de todos
Thank
vocês em ordem de preenchimento, e aqui tem um número de 1 a 359, são 359 pessoas com inscrição válida, sem registros duplicados. Eu vou fazer, tem uma função de busca, para quem gosta de Excel, né, pode ver aí, tem uma função de busca aqui, uma procura, né? O Excel vai sortear um número aleatório entre 1 e 359, vai sortear 6 vezes. Já avisando, é um sorteio, de repente pode repetir um número, se repetir um número a gente sorteia de novo o seguinte. Então eu vou usar a função aleatório entre, para quem gosta do Excel, né, aleatório entre 1 e 359. Deixa eu compartilhar a tela de outro jeito, que eu acho que ela não aparece assim. Deixa eu só fazer o seguinte, compartilhar tudo que tiver na minha tela, assim não tem erro. Então vocês vêm aqui, né, para quem quiser auditar, a fórmula é um PROC-V aqui, que busca na tabela o número sorteado. Então, a partir de agora, eu vou sortear o número aleatório entre 1 e 359. Eu vou calcular cada um, né, e fixar aqui o número. Então, o primeiro sorteado, aleatório entre 1 e 59. Entre 1 e 359. O primeiro sorteado eu registro 14. Deixa eu fixar ele aqui, para não perder. E agora eu vou calcular aqui. Fernanda Pessoa Alves Silva, primeira sorteada. Segundo, deixa eu deixar isso copiado também. 359. Próximo, 39. Vou escrever aqui o 39. Nós temos aqui, então, a pessoa é o Davi Miguel. Próximo, 199. Essa pessoa é o Cid Costa, mudou para o 102 aqui, perdão. Então já fica sendo o 102. Então foi o Cid Costa. Deixa eu pegar ele aqui. As coisas acontecem. Vamos ver que número que ele era mesmo. 102. 102. Vamos pro próximo. Aqui, o próximo, aleatório entre 298. Agora eu não vou comer bola. Aqui. Cleide Rejane da Silva. Eram 4, né, Mônica, pro livro, depois tinha mais 2, é isso?
Isso.
Então ficam esses 4 aqui, né? E agora os outros 2. Então vamos lá. Próximo sorteio, 359, olha só, o último a preencher. 359, que é William Palácio. E por fim, 139, que é o Danilo de Oliveira Sampaio. A gente vai entrar em contato com vocês pelo e-mail que vocês têm cadastrados, né? E a gente faz esses prêmios chegarem até vocês. É isso, eu já encerro minha participação aqui. Espero que vocês tenham gostado. Mônica vai falar ainda alguns recadinhos, não percam. Obrigado, pessoal.
Ok, pessoal. O que eu vou falar com vocês agora, vocês estão vendo a minha tela aqui, deixa eu colocar em full screen. Bom, como eu falei, a FIA agora vai estar com um curso novo, isso que não dá para ver direito aqui, isso, que chama o novo curso da FIA, que é Negócios Sustentáveis na Prática. A próxima turma começa em outubro, é um curso curto de 27 horas, no formato EAD ao vivo, como o de hoje. As inscrições estão abertas, se vocês quiserem, é só entrar no site da FIA e se inscrever. Também vou falar um pouco do outro curso que a gente tem, que já é um curso já está há vários anos que é o de pós-graduação da Gestão Estratégica da Sustentabilidade. A turma começa agora em setembro. Ainda tem algumas poucas vagas, mas para quem quiser se aprofundar nesse tema, esse é um curso de longa duração e esse é um curso de curta duração. A gente está convidando vocês para isso. Que mais que eu tenho aqui na minha agenda para falar para vocês? Agora eu vou passar a palavra para o professor Isaac, que vai fechar o evento. E mais uma vez, one more time, Jonathan, thank you so much again for coming here tonight. It was a pleasure to see you. I hope I'll see you soon around here. But now I'm handing over to Isaac, who will close and do the honors. Thank you, everybody.
Parabéns ao nosso brilhante palestrante pela excelente apresentação, que tenho certeza impactou a todos e que seguramente ajudará a nos tornar mais protagonistas nesta verdadeira guerra em que estamos envolvidos para enfrentar este grande inimigo denominado mudança climática e, assim, assegurar a recuperação econômica e a retomada verde na esteira do vencimento da batalha do Covid-19. Mais uma vez, muito obrigado, Sir Jonathan Porritt, e a todos vocês que nos prestigiaram nesse momento em que a FIA celebra o seu 40º aniversário. Convidamos a todos a conhecer os cursos e atividades do PROGESA, Programa de Gestão Estratégica da Sustentabilidade da FIA, focado na temática da apresentação de hoje. Com isso, encerro este evento, agradecendo mais uma vez e desejando uma boa noite a todos. Muito obrigado.
Good night, Jonathan. Thank you.
Good night. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Boa noite a todos no Brasil.